Welcome everybody to IHellene, the vodcast, if you want to call it that, that we bring to you. And it's our second one. And it's the vodcast where we hope to inspire you with the stories of Greeks from across South Africa and hopefully one day around the world. Stories that will inspire action, stories that will inspire more ideas, stories that will inspire somebody to do something exciting and innovative and that connects people. With us, my co-host Dimitri and a good friend.
Yes.
And we honoured to have as our first guest on this podcast another great friend, and Kubaro, and colleague in many respects, George Mazarakis. Now, George is, for those that don't know, was the executive producer of Carte Blanche, probably the most successful current affairs program in South African television history, amongst other things. George is a journalist by training, and we'll give him the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about his journey. And with us as well is Alexia, who is a student who just finished her studies in marketing and brand management.
Branding and business.
Branding and business. And I think that's one of the things that has impressed me about Alexia is her attention to the business side of branding. And I like that link that she brings along. And Alexia is currently interning with George at another venture of George that George is involved in. I've known George a very long time through his involvement also with the Greek community. George and I served together at the Federation of Hellenic Communities.
When you were president.
And you were my vice. And George has always been involved in the Greek community in one form or another. And one of his hidden talents, or not so hidden, but not necessarily that he's very well known for, is that he's a very good
Cantor.
A cantor.
Μπράβο. Δεν είναι ψάλτης.
Με έχεις ακούσει. Εσύ δεν έρχεσαι στην εκκλησία πολύ. Δεν σε έχω δει πολύ.
George is multi-talented.
Καιρό.
And certainly that's a lovely side of George's journey, I think. And one that is also very special in moments in my life. But we're here to talk about you, George. And I think your story starts in two wonderful places, I think. Kithira being one of them. An island that is close to my heart for my personal reasons. But and it's certainly a beautiful place. And it's a place that you've returned to in the last few months.
Indeed.
To decompress.
To live.
And to live. Well, we've brought you back.
You've brought me back. But I must say it's probably the most delightful experience of my entire life going there, to spend time there. Because one thing going from childhood very often, and have done since I was 14. My first trip there was on my own, entirely alone.
Oh, wow.
At 14, I'd never been overseas. And I'd never met any of my family. My entire paternal family lives there. Whereas in South Africa, we're third generation on the maternal side. But my mother's family also originates from there. So it was a natural thing to go there. Now, obviously, it was part of our upbringing, but it's a very different thing spending a solid 6 months, which I did, without leaving, And when it was time to leave, I really didn't want to, because I took to it like a duck to water. It's the most magnificent place, filled with history, from the Minoans all the way through to the current, So there's no end to interesting narratives that one finds there.
What was it for you that, because you've followed perhaps in some ways a unique path, what was it for you that put you on that path? What was it that
On the legal path?
No, on the
journalism path. Well, I have to correct your introduction, because you called me a trained journalist, and actually I'm not.
So
ironically,
fact-checking.
I'm an actor.
He's an actor.
By training. I'm not a journalist by training. So I have an honours degree in drama. and my particular speciality in that was acting. You get streamed. And only 4 of us from 250 landed up as in the acting stream. And I was a professional actor initially. My initial career was as an actor. So I worked for the then Performing Arts Councils. But I also, as a child, used to pretend to read the news. So I have recordings of myself at the age of 12 reading the local newspaper in the city where I was born, in Bloemfontein, as if I was reading a news bulletin. So when I was a student as an actor, I went and auditioned to read the news, and I became the youngest newsreader in the history of the SABC at the time, at 19.
A radio.
A radio newsreader. So after that, I carried on doing radio work during my student years, and then became an actor, and realized that I wasn't earning very much money as an actor. It's a tough life and not a very rewarding one financially.
Yeah.
In the army, when I did my national service, I landed up working in a television unit, which was an extension of the
Of your
drama
acting
stuff
in
in
the
a
drama.
way. But then,
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
indeed,
Colette.
you know those stories.
Absolutely.
And so in the end, I worked for a company in Pretoria making educational television. And one of my colleagues, who was a director, said to me, "But what do you really want to do? This is clearly not what you should be doing." I was bored by it. So I said, "Well, when I'm about 45, I'd like to read the news on television." And he said, "But why don't you do it now?" I said, "I think I'm a bit young." So I was about 23 at the time. And he said, "No, but you can." So I said, "No." He says, "Phone the SABC and ask them." So I said, "I'll do it some other time." And he picked up the phone and he spoke to Michael de Morgan, who was the main newsreader at the time, and he said, "Take the phone." So I spoke to him and I said, "Could I come in and do an audition?" So he said, "Yes, can you come next week?"
With the booming voice that we know already, must have been an opening.
Well,
surely.
I think the
That's-
radio work had played a role. But I mean, he didn't know how old I was or what I looked like or anything like that. And I went for the audition and he forgot. So I had psyched myself up for this and he wasn't there. And he said, "Oh dear, I forgot. Would you come back next week?" For me, it was quite a job to do that because I had to take leave from work and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I went back the next week, I did the audition, and I thought this was the most terrifying experience of my life. I'd never sweated so much in my entire life. And when it ended, I thought, well, at least I've survived the audition. And I went home, and on the Tuesday following, he phoned me and said, "George, it's Michael here. Would you mind reading the news on Friday night?" I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Would you read the news?" I said, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, would you read the news?" So I said, "Yes, of course I will." And had a sleepless week in anticipation of this horrendous experience, which was now going to be live. And that changed everything.
And was it an easy entry into journalism proper? So from just
Well,
reading what journalists had produced to actually
It didn't take long to realize that it wasn't gratifying to read other people's news bulletins. It was more of an actor's
correct another acting
role.
job. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a role really, because you sit down in front of a camera and as long as you can read fluently. He said to me, you know, it's not because you can read fluently. Lots of people can do that, but it's because you can remain cool under stress. When I hadn't thought of that, but they had given me a whole lot of things like a power cut in the middle of the audition and so on. And I didn't
A
realize that it
difficult
was a
name
test.
To
Yes.
pronounce, perhaps.
There are lots of those, you know, and there were funny things that happened with those sorts of things. But I thought that it was just a real power cut. I didn't think it was a test. So I just carried on as I thought one should. And he thought that they'd subjected me to stress. I now realize that that's not really that stressful.
No.
If you compare it to the stress that we do have.
But there's an interesting story you've told me about floods being your big break.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's right. So I went to Bloemfontein for a wedding where I was the kubaro at my cousin's wedding. And it was raining cats and dogs on the way there. But I didn't expect that there'd be a flood in the Free State and Northern Cape. This is in 1988. By then I'd been reading television news quite frequently. And then there was an opportunity to come and work on the national news desk at television as a news writer. So I thought it was a bit of a backward step salary-wise, but it put me in the news environment, and I'd rather have done that than being in educational television. And then it allowed me to read more frequent news bulletins. But I went down to Bloemfontein for the wedding, and this rain turned into a flood, and suddenly we couldn't leave. And my girlfriend at the time, whose name was Georgie, so George and Georgie went down. She was writing an exam in Pretoria and needed to get back. And the only way she could get back was one of the SABC helicopters. So I recognized this as a bit of an opportunity. And I said, why don't you go back in the SABC helicopter? I phoned the SABC and said, I'll stay in Bloem to help with the news reporting for television. They had sent a reporter down. I wasn't a television reporter, just a newsreader. And then when the moment came to fly, I thought, I better take a microphone with me and record for radio what I'm seeing, because, or either we could use that on television or something, but I'm not going to sit idly in the helicopter and just observe. So I did that. And then that evening when I got back, I edited it into a package and I sent it over to the then English service of Radio South Africa and a show called Radio Today, which was the current affairs flagship show in the mornings, the equivalent of the BBC's Radio 4. So I gave it to them and nobody said anything. And in the morning, I tuned in and I heard my report as a special report. And when it ended, they phoned me and they said, this is B. Reid, who was the main anchor, and she said, I'm retiring at the end of the month, but I'd like to offer you my job. Would you take it? So I was offered an anchor position because of how I'd covered the flood. And then I stayed on the air for the next few days covering the flood. But that was a major moment because it gave me an editorial role live on radio. And because the SABC was a bi-media organization then, I also was allowed to read evening television news, early evening news, and morning radio. And then the way the roster worked, we'd do radio in the morning and radio in the evening. So for 1 week, you'd do the morning, and the following week, you'd go to drive time radio in the evening. But it was an incredible opportunity, and that then led to becoming an on-camera reporter for television news, because the television was just more glamorous, I suppose, and offered more money. So eventually I made the decision to leave radio and focus on television, and then became an executive producer on Agenda, which was during the election of '94, the first democratic election. So I produced the debate between Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, and I became the principal executive producer of the election coverage of '94, with 28 live broadcast units throughout the country, feeding into one broadcast on 2 channels simultaneously. So I was taking care of English, but we dealt with 11 languages. So that was an extraordinary experience. And then off it was to Rhodes University to lecture, and that's the only formal journalism I ever dealt with.
So was that your alma mater?
Yes,
Okay.
but I'd studied drama, remember.
That's it.
Alexia, in hearing these stories and those pivotal moments, and I think part of it was also you were in the right place at the right time.
Very much
You
so.
grasped the opportunity.
But
and
you see,
used it.
now this is where I want to ask, is that in that flood moment, at any point, is it more of an instinctual feeling, like, I'm just going to do it? Or was it a feeling like, was it a premeditated
No, not
thought?
premeditated at all. But it was a recognition of the moment. It was just like, oh gosh, here's an opportunity to
Yeah.
do something I like doing, and let's see what happens with it. I didn't think that it would actually get me a job. I thought it would give me some degree of credibility in the job I was doing.
Yeah.
But it was also something I genuinely liked doing. So
Okay.
when I was a student, I used to take the radio equipment. Radio was part of my university course because by then I'd been reading news. So I'd take the equipment and I'd go and I'd describe things that I saw to see how well I could do it.
Okay.
So if there was a memorial service on the 11th of November, which was Armistice Day, and the mayor of Grahamstown would lay wreaths and the military would march and so on, I would go and stand there and describe the scene to see if I could do that. So when I saw a flood, I thought, I wonder if I can describe the flood. And it was an extraordinary thing, because the Orange River had burst its banks and become 8 kilometers wide at places.
crazy.
So the desert became a river.
Yeah.
The Koffiefontein Dam was under several meters of water. The wall was under meters of water, so we couldn't find the dam wall. And I don't remember the exact figure now, but it was something like 200,000 cubic meters of water per minute going through.
It's crazy.
And it's like vast quantities
Yeah.
of water that had been unprecedented in human memory. So obviously it had happened at other points in history.
You and I obviously worked on that, the Oscar Pistorius trial channel, which was probably the most successful television experiment ever. And
Yeah.
that rocked the world. And that, from that very high pressure environment to the idyllic life of the island, and where the pace is
It's
exponentially slower
yeah,
to
absolutely.
what you were used to for so many years.
Well, it was because I had done those things that I really needed to do this. I mean, I'd done carte blanche for 24 years. And to do a weekly television show with that sort of pressure for 24 years is a rather exacting experience and rather tiring experience on every level. So, and then Oscar, I brought Oscar to television, which was the first time that we'd managed to get a court to agree to broadcast a trial live. Worldwide, it hasn't happened to this degree. I mean, the O.J. Simpson trial was another example, but not at the same level, and not to 65 countries and so on. So, that's a very exhausting and stressful experience. A wonderful experience, but also tiring.
So for those who may not have seen it at the time, it was a pop-up channel that you created, is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
Just tell us a little bit about how you went about the process.
Well, I had the idea that we should make trial television happen, that trials are interesting, and that because parliaments are transparent virtually everywhere, and they're all on television, so the making of legislation is visible.
Right.
Why shouldn't the execution of that be visible? So in theory, every citizen is allowed to go to a court and observe a trial, but it's never happened on a mass level.
Right.
So if I were interested in the Oscar trial, but I was living in Cape Town, I would have to travel to Pretoria to go into the court. It may be my constitutional right to do that, but I have very limited access to it. First I started with the National Prosecuting Authority. I went and saw them with a lawyer, and my opening line to them was, Parliament is transparent, why aren't the courts? Why aren't the courts visible? Why aren't we seeing justice to be done? I mean, we have a right to see it being done, and that logic won the day. And then they said, well, how would the other side feel? So we engaged with the other side. Needless to say, they weren't keen, because they felt that this was an invasion of their privacy and so on. And in the end, it came up as a constitutional point. Would the right to privacy supersede the public's right to know or to see justice being delivered? And the judge in the High Court found in our favour and said, while Mr. Pistorius had a right to privacy, given what he'd done, his rights were curtailed when they were impinging on the rights of others. So that's what really won the day. And it's made a profound difference to all sorts of procedures in the country. So far from it being a tabloid experience, it was actually a highly responsible approach to covering trials. And it was very important to us that we observe the severity of the crime, and that we respect the privacy of the witnesses, because some witnesses chose not to be seen, and that we were happy to respect. So we covered their faces or we didn't show them, but their evidence was audible. So, and the cross-examination was audible. So the process was visible, and that was critically important. But it was important also to show that justice is blind. Whether justice was blind in this particular case or not is a moot point, because the Supreme Court of Appeal found that it was an erroneous judgment and then that sentencing was erroneous. So this judgment was questioned at the highest levels. But that was also important because even those decisions were publicly visible. And so people got to see and they got to understand legal principles that they otherwise wouldn't have. And they became so engaged in it because of the responsible way of reporting. So we'd have a legal analysis every night where a lawyer, as the presenter, would interview advocates and other legal experts and analyze what had happened in court that day and make sense of it to the layman. So it became compelling television. It scored the highest ratings in the history of South African television. And then all the international broadcasters took the feed and filled their channels with live court footage. So CNN, Sky News, etc., BBC, all carried it, even Greek television.
For me, what was also fascinating, not being a broadcaster, and I was dealing with more the commercial issues and business issues, but for me what was also very important was the editorial line on respecting the victim.
Yes.
Because she was, I think, a key persona in this narrative. And the way the broadcasters, and I'm glad George mentioned it, it was about responsible broadcasting without becoming tabloid and always respecting the memory of the victim. And that, for me, was number one. And number two, what was interesting for me was that it was never dumbed down.
No.
There was no instruction to the panels of lawyers and specialists to kind of take the level of discussion down. And what I took away from that was the enormous thirst in the South African public for good analysis, intelligent analysis.
How do you, as a journalist, take something that has a tabloid a bent in a sense and make it something that is about human rights, that is about looking at how can we elevate this story to justice, let people see.
Yes.
So, and perhaps you can segue to Alexia. You spoke about the large audience numbers and the engagement through social media, and maybe that could be.
Well, I think it was an extraordinary opportunity to exploit social media. But before I go there, it was also critically important to respect legal process and to observe the rules of court and to never veer from it. And one of the biggest points was that in the past, why television was disallowed was because television has a habit of segmenting, editing what happens in a court into sound bites and into uncontextualized sequences, rather than giving the entire thing. So it was very important to do an entirely live version, respecting it unedited, no commentary whatsoever, and observing that the strap lines at the bottom, which tell you what's going on, are absolutely word perfect and accurate for what was being said or what had just been said, so that people had if they just landed on it, could see what the context was. And then to repeat that, the entire thing unedited, with no commentary, from midnight till 6 o'clock in the morning. But from a social media perspective, and I'm sure you would have made a meal of it, because remember, this happened in 2014. So in 5 years, the development and the exponential growth of social media has been so profound. For them, it was an extraordinary achievement to have received 1,000 followers on Twitter per hour. We grew at a rate of 1,000 per hour. So it was an engaged audience. I mean, you would probably make money out of that now.
I think the reality is that, and it shows the difference where we're at in social media right now. Facebook just got backlash for fake news. So going back to what you were saying, where it's broadcasted verbatim, we can trust that now. We want to follow you on social media because now we know it's trustworthy. You set up a foundation of trustworthiness and trust. And so when we were going on social media and engaging on social media, it wasn't clutter. It wasn't something that could have been. It was actually quite important. So I understand why your numbers grew. There was incentive because now I trust who you are and what you were doing.
And engagement made people feel really committed to it. So the more the social media figures grew, the greater the television audience became. There was a direct link.
Yeah.
But what I find interesting now that you say is that the trustworthiness, and I think what is amazing about what George has done for 23 years at Carte Blanche is he's maintained the trustworthiness of Carte Blanche over that period of time. It's a trusted source of analysing stories. How does one do that?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, first of all, you can't go to air with anything untested.
Yeah.
You just don't. So no matter what you're doing, no matter who you're interviewing, even the most banal things often turn out to be complicated. So you might interview someone about someone like me, like you're interviewing me now, but you need to go back and fact check that everything that was said was correct, and that there isn't perhaps some agenda or something else at play that you're not aware of. So the research has to be of the highest standard. The only way to achieve that is by employing the best people and having an extraordinary team. I mean, creating a television show, in the case of Oscar, as much as in the case of Carte Blanche or any other show, it's only as good as the team, and it's never one individual. There has to be a leader, of course, but he's only as good as the people he surrounds him with, and himself with. And he has to be able to be challenged by those people and to challenge them in turn. But everybody in that team has to have really a robust way about them, because if they're going to be sensitive, they'll never survive, because everything they say has to be questioned and triple checked. And so when we talk about an investigative story, I mean, some investigative stories have taken 5 years to develop and to get to air.
Am I remembering correctly, did Carte Blanche not also do the floods in Mozambique?
Yes.
Tell us about that, because that also became quite a phenomenal story because of the person who was...
The woman in the tree.
Tell us about that.
Well, Carte Blanche then became... When I took over Carte Blanche, I decided that I couldn't give it what it had, because what it was up until then was just a magazine program which had one local story and 3 foreign stories in every broadcast. And coming from a news background, I felt that I needed to do news. So I brought news to it. So that when the floods happened in Mozambique, it seemed natural to me that we should cover them. And so I sent a team together with the military, and we found a woman on a tree who was pregnant and had to give birth.
Literally went into labour.
And literally went into labour on the tree. And the baby was born on the tree and saved by the military, who happened to grab mother and child in that instant. I mean, it's the most astonishing event.
Was that a turning point for the program, for Carte Blanche?
I think it was one of many that sort of turned Carte Blanche into a current affairs show.
Okay.
Because we then, initially I brought 2 local stories, and then within about 3 months, 3, and I kept it at 3 local stories for only about a year before I made it 4 local stories, because by then, you must remember, democracy had happened. So I was in Grahamstown after the elections of '94 teaching, and Mnet called me in to do Carte Blanche, which was an established program, but it was time for South Africans to tell their own stories shamelessly. And South Africans wanted to hear their own stories. Why would we want to be told stories from other countries as if we didn't have our own narratives? I mean, that's what South Africans related to, their own narratives. People watch television in order to see themselves. We watch because we see someone else having an experience similar to mine. I want to know how I would relate to that. If I can't relate to it, in the same way as this podcast won't work if there aren't other Greek people watching it, because it's the Greekness that draws us together. Our Hellenism is something that's so inherent to us. We see it because what would make me watch it is because I'm interested in what other Greeks are doing and how other Greeks see the world. Because Greeks see the world differently to a lot of other people. And we can't always quantify how, but we know it in our bones that fundamentally our experience of life is defined by who we are. And why would South Africans be any different?
So last question from me. From that young boy that was reading the news to the first newsread on radio, to the youngest on television, to one of the most successful executive producers, the longest running current affairs show, where's your journey taking you now?
Well, to Greece.
Tell us about that. You landed in Kythera.
Yes. And Kythera, sorry, I'm getting emotional now.
I'm happy.
And I'm surprised at my own response. But Kythera for me is going home. I feel a need to make a contribution to Kythera.
Yes, yes.
To say thank you to Kythera for bringing my parents and my grandparents here for the experiences we've had, but also that we have a responsibility to Kythera, because in a way, είναι γεννήτριά μας, you know, I mean, it's our DNA is Kytherian.
That's it.
So there are stories on Kythera that need to be told. And Kythera is extraordinary because it's just become one of the European destinations for trails, nature trails. And it's just won an award for being one of the best trail environments in the whole of Europe. And it's a pristine environment which is profoundly conscious of environmental matters. Yes. So it's an incredible place because it's only got a population of 3,000. It's normal, year-long population. Yes. That swells to between 25 and 30,000 on a given day during the summer. But it's also got a very rich history and extraordinary traditions. And I think they bear ventilation. People should know about them because they speak to cultural diversity, because the island was occupied by the Venetians for a very long time, from 1205 roughly to 1789, roughly, almost exactly, but I'm not certain of the date. But the point is that it's been occupied by foreign influences. It's had foreign influences. I have an English woman in my ancestry, Elizabeth Jemima Wilson, who married a great-great-great-grandfather in around 1810. So it's interesting. My son is the 11th generation to live in our family home on the island. Wow. So it feels like a natural thing to go back there. And I want to tell stories in film this time, not television, about Kythera and specifically about the Second World War is the one I'm working on now, because there are extraordinary characters from that period who deserve worldwide recognition for what they achieved, because they saved people's lives just by being real, decent people, by expressing humanity. Το φιλότιμο, αυτή την ανθρωπιά που δεν την βρίσκουμε κι αλλού. Αλήθεια. Μόνο στην Ελλάδα. Πιστεύω ότι έχουμε μια εξαιρετική έκφραση της ανθρωπιάς στην Ελλάδα. Μια ιδιότυπη.
To Magos Media for hosting us. We hope to see you again in our next one. And please give us your feedback. We'll be flashing up the email and contact details on the screen.
info@IHellene
info at IHellene, thank you,
.com.
.com, info at IHellene.com.
Γεια σας παιδιά.